Today on Whiskey Whereabouts, we are going to be tasting Old Pulteney 12-year. This is a 40% ABV that's watered down to the absolute minimum strength Scotch whiskey. It is chill filtered, it has fake color added, it has all kinds of problems. All of these things that we generally talk about avoiding and looking for whiskeys that don't have these types of red flags. So why are we talking about this whiskey today? And the reason is simple. This is a 12-year age statement single malt Scotch whiskey, and I paid $39.95 for my bottle, which means that this is a tremendous value if the whiskey is any good. 12-year whiskeys with this type of sort of profile, all these problems, they're not that uncommon. You can get your Glenlivet 12 years, Glenfiddich 12 years, same setup, 12-year age statement, single malt with all these problems. Usually it's going to cost you about $42, $45, so it's a few dollars cheaper here with the Old Pulteney, but even at that price, if it's still the same, sort of super basic, watered down, most entry-level type of whiskey, it's still not a good value. It's not really worth our time. This whiskey's got to be a bit better to be worthwhile to actually be a value even at this price. So they've got slight sort of oddities about the setup of the stills up at the Pulteney Distillery. They have a twin pair of pot stills at Pulteney, but these have some pretty exaggerated big round bulbs in the neck of the still, and it all comes down to chemistry, something called reflux. We don't need to get into the weeds about it, but basically we see a still with this shape. We expect a slightly lighter spirit than average to come out of it. But at the same time, they use something called worm tubs at Pulteney. This is an old-fashioned way. If you use that old method, as several distilleries do, like they do at Pulteney, when we talk about the worm tub, we expect a heavier spirit. So we've got one aspect of the process pulling in one direction, one in the other. Is this sort of contradictory? If so, why don't they just eliminate them and go for the baseline? Because it doesn't work that way. Every change you make, every decision they make at any distillery, at each step of the process affects the whole. This is a non-peated whiskey. It is bourbon cask matured. And the first thing that I get, despite all the talk, and it's there, that element of that sea air, sea breeze, that's how you'll hear it described. The reason we're making that distinction is that it isn't peaty. It's not briny, it's not sea water. It's fresh, salt, sort of air, in the air like you breathe by the sea. But the first thing that hits me nosing this is a sort of a leathery quality, a nice leathery quality. Kind of old oiled sort of leather furniture quality that is very, very warm, very pleasant, with that salt air and sweet caramel. And that may be the salt that's coming into, but caramel will often get this note for bourbon matured whiskey, and it's definitely here. There's another aspect to this nose that I've seen described in different ways. It's a spiciness, and it's like a cinnamon, like a cinnamon candy, not cinnamon, from the spice cabinet. Chewy, like a red hot, like candy, like cinnamon. Overall, it's a pretty pleasant, pretty welcoming nose, and it's a pretty rich nose for whiskey at this strength. Now, here's where we're getting into the sort of dangerous zone here with whiskey that's watered down, 40% whiskey. What I expect is a thinness on the mouthfeel, on the palate, and a short finish. A whiskey's not going to stay with you. But we're off to a good start with this nose on this whiskey. The other element here is a citrus element. It's like an orange. It's a sweet citrus. And that comes a little bit later. I'm only getting to it now underneath those other layers that I'm talking about. Very, very nice. Okay, so in terms of the mouthfeel, it's watery. There's enough flavor here that the vibe isn't thin, but it doesn't have much of a presence, sort of a tactile presence in terms of the mouthfeel. The finish is short, but it doesn't just vanish on you or just disappear. There is a little bit of kick to it. We'll get to that in a second. So far so good in terms of being above and beyond the sort of worst case watered down 40% whiskey. Okay, so in terms of flavor, we still have several sort of notes being played here. A lot of delivery on the promise of the nose, not a lot of surprise here. A lot of times you have a nose and then you go on a journey with a whiskey, and it's exciting, it's fun to be surprised. This one doesn't have a lot of surprises up its sleeve, but it's also not failing to live up. And so there's citrus here on the palate. Now I think it's a little bit more lemony than the orange before, and it's obviously a little bit more prominent than I'm talking about it first thing. The saltiness is still there. It has a nuttiness to it, like a salty nut, peanut maybe. It has vanilla cream more than that caramel now, and it has a really lively spiciness to it. It's not as sweet. I'm not getting that like cinnamon candy anymore, but the spice note is still there on the palate. Overall, very, very nice. Very, very pleasant. And what saves this finish is a burst of a pepper. It has that pepper spice, and a lot of times we'll get that sensation from a high ABV whiskey. This is not, but it does have like a black pepper sort of coarseness, which is nice. It's welcome. It gives it some texture and dimension on that finish, and it has a real. There is a slight note of bitter, but it is not at all like overwhelming or out of balance, like tannic, like over oak bitter. It's like a dark chocolate. It kind of runs through. When you're really sort of concentrating on it, you can kind of still perceive that. That's the last sort of note that's still echoing at the end of it. And it is a pretty well balanced. It still has a sweetness to it. On that finish, and there's almost like almost a mintiness to it that is tying into that. Now it's gone honey, and that's a very common bourbon sort of cast note. And so we've got a lot of the same elements, and they are sort of changing their tune just a little bit with each level of this whiskey, but it's not losing anything. And what's really important about this whiskey is that it has some lively flavors and it doesn't have any off notes at all. So I'm not getting anything that is rough around the edges, doesn't quite match. I wish this was in a warehouse a little bit longer. The biggest weakness of this whiskey is that it is a little thin, it is a little light. But at the same time, you may have that, that vibe when you're looking to drink a whiskey. You don't only want to drink, cask strength, peat monsters. Sometimes you want a nice light on its feet whiskey, and this one absolutely fits the bill. This is a really nice whiskey for kick back and have a very sippable dram on the back deck, watching the game, something like that. It's a really it's solid, and it is better than you would expect for a whiskey with these specs. And we never know what's going to happen. When we add the water to the whiskey, it's not always just about watering down a big cask strength whiskey. Sometimes 40% whiskey will go in a totally new direction. Sometimes it will just wash everything out. So I'm going to put, I still have a bit in here, so I'm going to put a few drops to just see what water does to the old Pulteney. And the first thing it's done is turn down the volume on some of the sweeter elements on that nose. Now the nose is a little bit more, that salt air is there, big time. And it's got a little bit of the, more of the woodiness to it that really wasn't prominent before. That cereal grain note's more grassy. That cinnamony note is still there, but it's much more subdued. Overall, it's mellowed out, the nose. But the rest of the experience has kind of survived it. Maybe a little bit more tanginess. I honestly think what the water has done across the board on this whiskey is not eliminate, but turn down a lot of the sweetness, especially that sweet flavors we expect from that bourbon cask, that caramel, that honey. And some of the more lively elements and the spicier elements have remained. So it doesn't need water. And I think the nose is probably the strong sort of element on this whiskey. So I am reluctant to tamper with it. I do think that it's worth cutting it with a little water because I think you are going to notice some of the more complex elements that are going on here. So overall, what do we think about this whiskey? It is a very well-balanced, pretty decently complex whiskey, all on its own. Let's forget about the price point. It is absolutely a pleasant, drinkable whiskey at this ABV, especially at full strength. It's a very satisfying finish. It makes you want to go for another sip. It's very, very nice. All in all, this is not the best single malt Scotch whiskey you're going to ever have. Is it the best single malt Scotch whiskey that you're going to buy for less than $40? It may be. Let me know in the comments what you would nominate for the best value. I don't want to see any whiskeys that cost more than $50, but show me what you would say is the best value for Scotch whiskey under the $50 price point, and see if we have any candidates that could step up to the old Pulteney 12-year. But in the meantime, I would say at that price, I mean, I've seen it creep up. I've seen it for $42, $45. Once it's breached that $45 mark, you might as well come up with another $5 and get yourself into the next level. And so I'm gonna say at that price, 3.5 glasses on this whiskey. And if you're interested in value in single malt Scotch whiskey, check out my video on the top 5 Scotch whiskeys under $60. I'll put it right here. Remember to subscribe for more videos like this.